Alrighty, so now we get to a discussion about ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, which are sort of ways of understanding and grappling with the challenges of living in a world that is multicultural, even when we're talking about societies that are not multicultural. And Canada definitely is multicultural. There's a lot of sort of cultural ideas that sort of swirl around in this environment, but even if we're talking about cultures where there isn't that kind of multiculturalism, we're still dealing with a world where different people have different cultural ideas. And that's sort of where we get to places about ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, which is largely a question about how do we understand cultures other than our own. So, for example, we'll start with ethnocentrism. This is probably the one that there's a lot of history in the Western world that is anchored in ideas of ethnocentrism. Let's start with that. So, in an ethnocentric perspective, you start from the place of assuming that your cultural background, whatever it is more is the best outcome. And there's a lot of arguments in philosophy that suggest that this might well be, a necessary thing, that if you didn't think your culture was awesome, it will be really hard for you to follow the rules of your culture and therefore to fit in. So there's that kind of piece. And that's sort of the benign version of this. When we talk about what this becomes in the sort of real world practical applications, what you wind up with is the idea that when we talk about ethnocentrism, practically this becomes the philosophical and the idea-based justification for people primarily in North America and in Europe to essentially try to impose their culture on everybody else. So if you want sort of the philosophical underpinnings of colonialism and that kind of thought, you're in the space of sort of ethnocentrism in that space, because the Western Europeans, that kind of grouping, made the assumption that their cultural position, their religion, their philosophies, their forms of social organization, their language, all of it was superior to the cultures and languages, etc., that existed in the spaces they colonized. So that includes all of the actions to sort of eliminate or minimize or westernize indigenous cultures in North America, as well as conversations around apartheid in South Africa. Like, ethnocentrism leads us to a lot of relatively dark places in world history because of that assumption that one group can be like, well, my standards are the best, so I'm going to judge you by those, and when you come up wanting, I'm going to tell you you need to be more like me. Okay? So that's ethnocentrism, and I do sort of want to highlight that, like, this is not exclusively a bad thing. Some people are just going like, oh, well, that's interesting, I like my culture better, and that's technically ethnocentrism. But when we talk about ethnocentrism written into policy and government stuff, you wind up in really uncomfortable places, like, cultural genocide. It's a thing. So that comes out of our conversation about sort of ethnocentrism in that space. The next one I want to talk about in the next sort of way of judging cultures is the idea of cultural relativism. And cultural relativism starts from a different place than ethnocentrism. And cultural relativism starts from the assumption that the only way to be able to understand if an action or a policy or a practice makes sense or is good for a culture is to understand it in the context of that culture. So you judge a culture by the norms of its own people and its own rules. And this is great in a lot of ways because it allows for a sort of intellectual understanding that there may be very well multiple ways of solving a similar social problem, right? That there's nothing inherently better about socializing children in nuclear families with their parents and their biological siblings. There's maybe nothing inherently superior about raising children that way versus raising children at the level of a broad community where everyone participates in that process. So it's really great from that perspective. But if you take it to its sort of extreme and you say the only way you can understand those sorts of norms, it can put you in a place where you are forced to accept justifications that seem abhorrent or really difficult for you as a person. So if you, for example, say, well, you can only understand a culture from the rules within it, there's no real space to say, but all women across the world should have the right to vote and should be allowed to determine who they marry. Because from a cultural relativist perspective, there might be a justification that makes perfect sense within a culture to sort of argue that this 13-year-old girl needs to marry this 45-year-old man because her family and his family say so. Um, and and the reason for that would be that within the culture, this is by and large accepted. And that is often a really uncomfortable place for students to get to because on the surface, at like first glance, cultural relativism seems way better. And for a lot of things, it is. But it's like everything else in sociology, right? Like it's not, very few things are like universally good or universally bad. There's a lot of sort of nuance and a need to understand that. So one of the things that you need to understand is that if you're a cultural relativist, you really kind of have to be a cultural relativist about everything, in that you might find cultures that justify and are perfectly comfortable with ideas that you personally have a lot of trouble with and struggle with immensely. Just to be aware of that sort of tension. There are challenges with both of those approaches.